Okay. All right. Good to see everybody. Carol, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Ricky. Good, thanks. So
Good.
happy to see you.
You too. Thank you. Thank you. We don't see you, but happy to hear you. Happy to hear you. Great. So thank you, everybody. We're starting Sefer Shoftim, the book of Shoftim. It has, I would say, one common theme that just repeats and repeats and repeats. So what I'd like to do in terms of our approach to it is to sort of get the parameters of that common theme not locked down tonight. And then rather than going through chapter by chapter to bump back into that theme over and again, we'll highlight key people, extraordinary people, some of those remarkable Shoftim, and learn about them and their leadership in their lives. So, those of you who have learned Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, what would you say is the absolute theme, that recurring theme? Anybody remember from back in the day? Yeah.
Don't the people, like, they sin and then they get a prophet comes and helps them to get back on track, and then they sin again, and then there's
Exactly.
like that.
That's exactly right. So let's build a little background. So first of all, the author we hold of Sefer Shoftim is Shemuel Hanavi, Samuel, whose book we'll learn, God willing, next. Samuel is a spectacular person, and I think we'll very much enjoy learning about him. The son of Elkanah. He wrote this book. He wrote his books, which are split into two parts, and he wrote Megillat Ruth. They're all around the same time period, in that 100 or so years after Yoshua. The theme, as Serene said, goes like this. The Jewish people didn't conquer all of Eretz Israel. They conquered only portions of it. And in each tribe's portion, overwhelmingly, there was still the Canaanite nations. Different nations still existed within the geographic domains of just about every tribe, which meant, they violated a mitzvah d'oraita, the biblical commandment to remove those tribes. Okay, leaving that aside, some put heavy taxes on those tribes, which from a halachic point of view is not the same as exterminating them, which they were commanded to do, but it's enslaving them. In halachic terms, when someone is paying a tax that others are not paying, that's halachically called abdut. So in fact, just parenthetically, in Egypt, when we were originally initially enslaved, we weren't enslaved with forced hard labor. We were enslaved with taxes that the average Egyptian wasn't paying. So whenever there's a disproportionate level of taxes vis-a-vis a population, from a Jewish law point of view, that's considered abdut or slavery. So some of the tribes enslaved these other nations, but still didn't remove them. Why didn't they remove them? Well, there was no confederation of tribes. In the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, Yehudah teams up with Shimon, and they go out and they rout a number of the Canaanite nations. But otherwise, it was each tribe on their own. And they never banded together. They never confederated. They never became a United States to have the wherewithal to go out and fight. That's one possibility. Now, the fact that we were on this cycle is really what I want to focus on. So you have Yoshua and the Zakenim, who left a tremendous legacy, and then that entire generation passes, and the next generation is this generation we're talking about that strays away from God, being heavily influenced by the Goyim, who are intimately close to them, cry out to God because they've been enslaved, they've been warred upon, they've been oppressed through taxes, or all of the above. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will send a Moshiach, a helper, a savior. That person will live 30, 40 years, whatever it might be, as the leader of the nation. He or she passes, and within a short period of time, they go right back down. Now, I want to read just 4 or 5 psukim, which sort of create that identity for the Sefer. So it starts with this in Perek Bet, in Pasuk Zayin. V'abdu ha'am et Adonai. And the Jewish people worshipped God, Kol Yimei Yoshua, all the days of Yoshua, V'chol Yimei HaZakenim, and all of those days of the elders, of the wise elders. Asher ha'arichu yamim achrei Yoshua, who really lived an extended period of time after Yoshua died. Asher ra'u et kol ma'aseh Hashem. These were the people who saw all those miracles we talked about in Sefer Yoshua, who saw the splitting of the Jordan, who saw the sun and the moon stand, who saw these incredible, extraordinary, one-sided battles. So that generation, during that generation, as we said a number of times, that was the greatest generation. Those people saw et kol ma'aseh Hashem, Hagadol Asher Asali Israel, those great things that God did. Then, Vayamot Yoshua ben Nun Ebed Hashem ben Me'ah ve'eser shanim. Yoshua dies at the age of 110. V'gam kol hador hahu, and that entire generation eventually dies out. Vayakom dor acher acharehem, and here's where I want you to zone in. Here's where we're going to focus. And another generation arose after them, Asher lo yadu et Adonai, who didn't know God. Now, didn't know God is where our challenge is. V'gam et ha'maaseh asher asa Yisrael. They didn't know God, and they didn't know all the wonderful things He did. A couple more psukim. Vayakom Hashem Shoftim v'yoshium miyad shotzehem. What would God do every so often? He'd inspire a leader to emerge, to take the leadership role of the people, militarily and very often spiritually. That person would right the wrong, would get people back connected to God, and this bad stuff would go away. One or two more quick psukim. V'cheikim Hashem lahem shoftim, v'yah Hashem im hashofet. When these leaders would be appointed, God would be with them. And at that point, we would be freed from our enemies during all the years of that shofet, of that judge, because God would forgive us. And once the shofet died, v'haya b'mot hashofet, yashuvu v'hishchitu me'avotam. They went back to their old ways. Now, we're going to go through the 20 some odd, 30 some odd chapters of this book, 20 some odd chapters of the book, and you're going to find that's the recurring theme, exactly as Serene described. Now, what I want to focus on tonight is why. Why? Why was it that without a leader, we were lost? Why was it that almost immediately after the leader passed away, we dropped dramatically again, and then again, and then again? There was no cumulative growth. There was no residual positive to what happened. How could it be? And why was it? And how do we look at it today? Good? So let me hear some thoughts. How could it be that time after time, right after a period of extraordinary leadership, of educated leadership, of spiritual growth, of connecting to Kadosh Baruch Hu, boom, a year, 2 years, 3 years go by, and we're out in the street again. Hi, Joy, welcome. And we're out in the street again. What do you say? We want to relate this to our time. We want to relate it a little bit back to Tisha B'Av. We want to relate it also to our families and our overall perspective. So tell me, why was it, in your opinions, that as soon the thing didn't stick? Why didn't it stick? What do you say?
Maybe it's because of the leadership itself.
In what sense? What could that have been?
Like you see, like actually was talking about this, I heard this last week, like a lot of leaders, certain leaders would want that spotlight and they want to be a leader for themselves, and other leaders want to pass that on and see other leaders grow as well.
Okay, beautiful.
So maybe
So
that could be.
I'm gonna extend what you said, Sonny. I'm gonna extend it a little bit to a classic difference of opinion in Yahadut. And I want you to hear this very carefully because it's a very serious issue. And it has a different sort of face today, but it's an important issue to confront in today's terms. There was a machloket, a disagreement between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. The school of Shammai said that the only person who should really engage in Torah is a person who is Chacham already, has a certain intellectual capacity, is humble, has lineage, comes from a noteworthy family, and is wealthy, can sustain himself. Again, Beit Shammai said, the only person who should be learning Torah is a person who has a certain level of intelligence to begin with, humility, a legacy, and financial strength. So what was Beit Shammai doing? They were putting a huge wall around the yeshiva, so to speak, letting only a handful of people in. Rabban Gamliel said a similar thing. He said the only people who should come into the yeshiva are the people who have a certain way about them, who are hagunim, who are prepared, which meant that for hundreds and hundreds of years, many, many hundreds of years, in fact, the Torah was limited to a certain small group of people. You know, to extend Sonny's point a little bit, it was institutionalized that the Hamon Am didn't know anything, that average people didn't have access to Torah, because the concern was, Derech Eretz Kadmada Torah, a person's nature has to be pre-established. He has to be set and formed as a vessel before he can receive Torah. So if the vessel isn't good, the Torah will be corrupted. And this held for a very long period of time, for many, many hundreds of years, until Beit Hillel blew the doors of the yeshiva open. And there are stories of Hillel lying on the roof of the yeshiva building, trying to catch ideas of Torah, because at that point, he hadn't been allowed in yet. Now, today, we don't have that perspective at all, right? We're completely democratic. But imagine a world where it was, Yoshua and the Zikanim who knew something, who had the ability to learn, who learned, who studied, and everybody else was only kept connected by the power and persuasion of those leaders, and or by the fantastic events that took place in their lifetimes. Because how much can you tell over a fantastic event? And how meaningful is it, even if you tell it over very well? So as an extension of Sonny's point, I would say that one of the main reasons that in this period of time, and for a period for many hundreds of years following, that Bnei Israel, the Jewish people, kept swaying, kept going away, is because How wouldn't they? What might have kept them connected? Torah wasn't democratized. It wasn't available. It was kept to a very limited group of men, and that was that. So if you weren't in the shock and awe period of a great miracle, you probably lost interest at a certain period of time. What are your thoughts on this first premise?
They weren't not allowed to learn Torah. Like they learned Torah all the time in the desert. Like why all of a sudden when they got to Israel did they feel like they weren't allowed to learn like everyone else?
Very nice. So it wasn't institutionalized, right? So the Torah they learned in the desert, they learned it absolutely in some informal fashion, but it seems like it still wasn't a very widespread thing. It seems like it was overwhelmingly centralized to Moshe, Yoshua, and the Zikanim. And yeah, they definitely learned something. I think what they learned primarily was the presence of God. Maybe that was the primarily internalization of the desert. But to say they were sitting in the yeshiva with a book in front of them or something, probably not the case.
Right.
So the acculturation that they got in the desert, to your point, Serene, they got an acculturation in the desert, right? A very important one. But maybe it was limited. Maybe it only took us to a certain point where, I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example. And some of you who've learned with me for a while know this. I believe that classes like this are very important. But more important than this is for each of us to be expressing our own Torah ideas and to be teachers in the perspective of either literally teaching others or writing your ideas down and developing your own self, your own persona, your own identity in Torah. And some of the people on this class know that because we're actually doing things like that, where the person has the opportunity, which is what every Torah Jewish person should have, the opportunity to develop your persona as a Torah thinker. So the frontal teaching is great because it builds something, and there's an absolute and important platform, an essential platform. But if that platform has to be overwhelmingly focused to each listener becoming a teacher, one person teaches it in this style, one person stands up in front of the room, one person writes a beautiful essay, one person does it this way with their family. But the point has to be, and this all really goes back to Sunny's point, what's the job? What's the job? The job of a teacher is to create teachers. The job of a leader is to create leaders. And that's exactly the point. Any other thoughts so far?
So do you think because they weren't actively learning Torah, the outside influences are what that they were attracted to? Because if they weren't learning what they were supposed to, then they picked up what they could.
Super. All right, excellent. So let's talk about that point. So we have this very important law, Deoraita, biblical law, and I want to tease it out with you very carefully because it's very subtle and it touches on exactly what Joy is referencing. The Torah prohibition is ubechukotehem lo telecho. In their chukim, we can't follow. Now, what is a chok? We know we have chukim in Judaism. What is a chok?
It's with no reasoning.
Great. So a chok is something that we say we don't reason. It could be reasoned, but we don't reason it through. Essentially, why? Because it defines our relationship with God. So I don't need a reason to do Shabbat, Kashrut, or anything for that matter, because really it defines how I think. It defines my life. So the reason will only limit the application. So that's why Chaim Ovadia Yosef, building on the work of others, says that everything in Judaism is a chok. What do you mean? Aren't certain things mishpat? Aren't certain things mitzvot? He says no. He said they could be called that for expediency, but in fact, everything is a chok, meaning we don't care about the reason, even if we found it, because what it is defines us. Whether it's Shatnez, where we still haven't found the reason, or Shabbat, where we can identify in our human level umpteen reasons, whatever it might be. But we don't look for the reason because it's who we are. Now,
You
let's
could also say that it's all mishpat too.
you
you
could say it's
all
almost not true, but I'm saying the interesting thing is that we veer away from that and we say it's all chok. Now, chok doesn't
Right.
mean, if this is what you're implying, chok doesn't mean I don't apply my logic and apply my reasons and take what I take from it individually. Super, of course, but it means the reasons have to be qualified in my mind as a very, very limited interpretation of the purpose. And if I keep it at that, you know what? I think the reason for Shabbat is A, B, C, D, E, but I know that level of reasoning is limited to my thought process, and real reasoning is infinitely more. Then I'm great. Now, when it comes to the goyim, we have a very interesting din, very interesting law, and that is that we can't go in their chukim. Now, what are some of their chukim? Well, we call certain things. Let's start with chagim. Holidays would be one, right? So that's simple. Most of us would never think about celebrating a Christian holiday or a Muslim holiday. But then the question becomes, well, what about an American holiday like Thanksgiving? When Thanksgiving came on the scene for the Jewish community, of course, it's been on the scene in America for a long time, but when it became something for the Orthodox Jewish community in the 1920s, 1930s, the rabbis were really challenged. This is not Jewish. It's not really Christian, although the society is Christian. So how do we feel about this? And there was a lot of back and forth. And in certain circles, there still is. We celebrated, all of us, because it's not a religious holiday, but it's still not a Jewish celebration. So there is a school of thought, a growing school of thought in the Haredi community, in the more ultra-Orthodox community, that they don't even, there's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to think about. There's no such thing as Turkey in their lives. Now, is that wrong or right? It's neither. If we hold with we shouldn't affiliate with them. We shouldn't look or behave like them. Then maybe Thanksgiving is an expression of that, as is July 4th or Labor Day. Now, again, in our community, that's not what we hold. We hold these are not religious holidays, so we enjoy them because they stand for important and beautiful things. But some of the rabbis do say, don't make a seudah on Thanksgiving. In other words, if you're going to have turkey, don't wash and have bread. Don't give it the semblance of importance that we would give to a Jewish holiday. Right? Makes sense. Okay, so far?
Are you saying they shouldn't have bread on Thanksgiving?
I'm saying that some rabbis say that in order to be crystal clear, the distinction between a Thanksgiving meal and a Shabbat meal or a holiday meal, we should make sure to leave out the bread to make sure that in our minds there's an absolutely clear distinction in one of the defining elements of the holiday, which is the meal.
Okay.
That's what, that's what some of the rabbis say. It's an interesting perspective. Now, what
I
about?
agree.
Huh?
I agree.
Okay. What about the name Ricky, or the name Mickey, or Serene, or Sonny, or David and Rachel? No, you're okay. What about What about Carol? Joy, you would probably say is okay as well, right? What about those of us who have American names, who don't have Jewish names, right? Now, some people would say, that's too similar to the Goyim. Okay, we don't hold that way in our community. We never did, and we don't. We don't. More and more children are taking on Jewish names, beautiful thing. But we never held that way. But the point is that now you have this nurturing Jewish nation in a new land with one tribe here and one tribe there and one tribe there. And in between them, these established, strong, culturally strong nations that are interacting with them, that are doing business with them, that are signing peace treaties with them. Over time, Reuven became Ricky, and Shimon became Simon, and maybe Simon gravitated to a lifestyle where his clothing looked more like the Goyim and his hairstyle. You know, I always struggled personally with the way some Ashkenaz, European Ashkenaz dress. They dress like Europe of 150 years ago, and I didn't understand it. But I understand it more as time goes on, because that was the distinctive dress in Poland or Russia or other parts of Eastern Europe to distinguish them from the Goyim. And that distinctiveness is essentially important for them to keep. So even though we're in America, and even though that kind of dress is 150 years old, it's their identity. And rather than their first language being English, which it is for all of us, it's going to be the mother tongue that was the mother tongue 100 years ago, which is Yiddish. Why? Because it goes back to this thing of creating as much distance as I can between me and the Goyim. Let me hear your thoughts on this point.
But I want to ask you, what was it like in Syria?
Fantastic question. Tell me what you think it was like.
I'm wondering, were there any, Syrian country holidays that they took part in, or like, what were their names all Jewish, or were they Syrian? I feel like maybe, I'm not sure.
Maybe what?
But they didn't distinguish, Ricky, they didn't distinguish themselves like European. They didn't do that. I mean, they didn't dress that differently.
They didn't dress differently. No, we didn't dress differently. And we know from the people who joined the community in the 1990s and the early 90s that a lot of them came with Arabic names, right? Just like us. So I think we kept our separateness, but culturally we interacted a lot.
So
And in our case,
comparable to now?
I don't see why not. I haven't heard it differently. The way I've heard it is that, yes, we had very good relations with the Muslims, did a lot of business with them, particularly good relations with the Christian Arabs, did a lot of business with them in Syria. In fact, when a number of the Syrians left, people there, non-Jews there, took care of their property and safeguarded it for them until they could get it out. So from what I understand, it was very good. It was very good. The issue is, and I'm not saying it should be anything different. The issue comes in that if you don't have item number one, which is the individual grounding of Torah, you don't have it in your own life or in your family's life. And then you have the acculturation with the Goy, you probably have what's going on in America now in the Ashkenaz world, right? Where 70-some-odd% are marrying out because they don't have the groundedness in Torah and tradition and family and community that we, not by any choice of our own, just by God's beautiful love of us individually has given us. So how do they end up? They end up in a difficult place because the culture of the non-Jews isn't barbaric. American culture isn't barbaric. Americans are the most enlightened people on the planet. In the same way at the time in Syria or at the time in Germany before things changed. So the point is that in order to understand life, we need to understand history. And if something is written in the book of the Navi, it means it wasn't true then, it's true forever. And we need to look at Jewish history for the extent of time that we can look back at it and see where the acculturation and the mix was devastating to us. And you know, they talk about the period of the Enlightenment in the mid 1800s in Europe and times like that, where there was a panic in the Jewish community because the emancipation and allowing the Jew out of the ghetto was spectacular in many respects, but it was incredibly destructive in other respects, where we became a lot like them. And we saw that they're not bad people. And we began to intermarry and to so on and so on. So that's effectively what happens here. We don't have that strong basis in Torah. It's like a Jew growing up in a small community in Iowa. What does he know? And he meets a delightful young lady in college, and she's delightful, and her family is religious, and they have ethics and values, and they're truly good people. They truly are. And in short order, there's what we call hipodalut, or an assimilation, or so on. So we have to extrapolate that type of thing happened here. That it starts with, and to Serene's point, and it's a very important point, I want to think about it some more. What about all that Torah learning that happened in the desert? And there was, right? That's what they did for 40 years. How come it went only to one generation, a generation with very strong leaders, and then didn't go to the next? It's a very important point. I hadn't thought about all that 40 years of Torah learning.
But they were also isolated, so they didn't have outside influences.
Right, yeah. They were isolated, yeah. But if they had the 40 years of learning, maybe it should have carried them further, but it didn't. And the Sefer Shoftim highlights that there were two defining points to keeping them anchored. One was these Masim Gedolim, these fantastic events that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had them see. And the second was a strong leader. So let's just jump ahead for a minute to our place in time, to our point in time, to our community, to our perspective about the Jewish community, to our families. How do we blunt this? How do we approach this? Let me hear some of your thoughts.
Not assimilating, you're saying?
Yeah.
I think we're very lucky and unique that we're in this community to begin with. I would say family is probably the number one thing, and then staying close to everybody.
Right. Good. And we have to know a couple of other things. A, we're placed in this community by no choice of our own, so we're very blessed in that. But B, we need to know that the obligation to educate our children in Torah is on the mother and the father, not the teacher. And we created a surrogate setup in the last 100 or so years in the Jewish community. But it wasn't like that. The father would learn with his son, the mother would learn with her daughter. And that's the way it's meant to be. Over time, when people either didn't know enough or couldn't support themselves financially in order to do that, to spend the time with their children, we ended up giving it over to third parties. But it's my obligation to be my children's rabbi. It's my obligation and my opportunity to be my daughter's teacher. And the When does that obligation end? Never. Is it ever too late for that obligation to kick in? No, it's never too late. And I wanted just to drill it down to that very, very local level and say that we're going to talk about a couple of other reasons why this may have gone on, but I think the educational backbone was not there. It wasn't individualized, nor was it widespread. And when it's not there, and when I have these enticing and fabulous and established and age-old cultures around me, then I gravitate to that. Now, there's another very important just sidebar here, and in current terms, and that is that when a parent establishes his or her child's approach to Torah based on the parents' Torah, yeah, my Torah, my wife's Torah, each of your ability to give over Torah, we need to know that our children will, if our Torah is not in their face, if what's presented to them is a pick and choose type of approach to Torah, then that's somewhat problematic for a young adult, and they will not understand that properly. You know, what we've seen in time in our own community is that, you know, everybody has to be their own rabbi or teacher, and I can't say that enough times. And when a parent doesn't assert his or her role enough in that respect, the child will pay the price. On the other hand, when the learning is in the home, when the books are open in front of the child, when there's learning at the table with a book open, the child may not pick it up when he's 10 or 15 or 20. Maybe it's when he or she is 40. But that child knows that in our home, mom had a book open at the Friday night table and taught an idea. And that has spectacular value. Good? Any thoughts? Okay. Great. Okay.
Wait, I have another question.
Yeah.
Do you think, going back to comparing it to Syria and in the past, do you think it's harder now to pass it over to our children because there are so many levels and the kids are exposed to many different levels? Like, we're not all as a community on the same page.
Right. Well, I think it's a life's work for a parent to stay up to date with the level of each child, because children change and their needs change and their insecurities grow in one area and their strengths and confidence grow in another area. So, and I'm at a different stage than some of you. I would say David and I are at a different stage where we already have almost young adult age grandchildren. And you see, even when you have a young adult age grandchild, that your child, his or her self-esteem is still overwhelmingly coming from you. And you're still that child's primary teacher, even if she's 40. It's a remarkable thing, because that's really how we're hardwired. Even though the Torah says that a person will leave his mother and father and cling to a spouse, it's true up to a point. So I think that our job throughout time is to understand our children's needs, to attempt to approach them through Torah, knowledgeable Torah. Everybody with a book, everybody with his or her ideas written on a piece of paper, that has profound value. It's one thing, you know, for the rabbi to give a great class or something like that. And of course, that's wonderful. But what we want to be doing is bringing that home. And it's our job, each of us, to understand each child as he or she evolves into adulthood, into middle age, whatever it might be, and still be the Torah personality in our children's lives. The Torah personality. That's our challenge and opportunity. What do you say? Shireen, what do you say?
No, I agree. But are you saying to lead by example, meaning more about action based, or are you talking about actually like obviously learning with them, but it's a lot of action too, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yes, it's both. But the action without the book is not enough. I would
Right.
say that the book would generally couple, readily with the action, but the mind blower is the book. That's the mind blower. When you
Right.
walk into your Shabbat table and you open a book and you share a line or two with the kids, that will never, never be forgotten. Never be forgotten.
It's true.
Because the book itself in Judaism somehow has a beyond physical value. And we learned this a number of months ago, where we said that every time you open a sefer, it's as if you're learning with God himself, that he's the one speaking the ideas on the page that you're reading. And it's nothing less than that. So I would say for people like us, the book is certainly not less important than the actions, maybe more. And I think it's a memorable, iconic picture in our children's and grandchildren's minds. Nothing beats that. Yeah, David, what do you think?
I agree. I really do. And I agree with you saying that we influence our grandchildren a lot.
Yeah.
Also, like, I can't explain it, but there's certain things that I didn't do with my own children that I do with my grandchildren. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, I learned with my grandson today. It wasn't easy. Wasn't easy. He's a 7-year-old. Wasn't easy. But it was great. And we're going to try to do it more often. And as often as we do, he now knows that his grandpa is serious about learning and was able to open a book and go through a handful of psukim with him. And everybody do it on the level that we're comfortable. Hebrew, English, this text, that text. Okay. Because I think had the Jewish people at that stage or in present day, had we been people of the book, if every Jewish young adult in America was able to approach a Jewish sefer, a Jewish book, I don't think we'd have what we have, which is this clinging to lifestyles that are not ours. And maybe that's what was going on as well. Then when you get a fabulously charismatic figure like a Devorah or a Yakniel Ben Kenaz or people like this that we're going to talk about, who's fabulously charismatic, a Donald Trump, a John Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, whatever, Bill Clinton, whoever they were, these charismatic men, Navdil, not that they're like the Jewish leaders, those people then move the generation up for a time, but the staying power isn't there. Okay, let's talk about one other possibility. There's an interesting theory that Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, alav hashalom, who was one of the giants of 20th century Ashkenaz world, said about the events where things went wrong for us as a people. And listen to this. He has a fabulous approach. And it's a more difficult approach. So take a couple of minutes and let's see if we can own it. Because, again, it speaks to us today as well. He says that, the Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies, the 3 types of sins that we believe were committed during the first temple: idol worship, inappropriate relations, and murder. And the sin of sinat chinam, baseless hate, that was committed to bring about the destruction of the second temple. Those things that we see on the sinat chinam, the baseless hate, or the certain types of behavior, inappropriate behavior, is the symptom. The cause, the basis, Rav Soloveitchik writes, is a lack of individual and collective will. And with a failure of the individual or collective will, then these things happen. They are only surface things. They're only symptoms of a deeper issue. How do you feel about that? You said everything goes back to the lack of will. And every success is about the forcefulness and the courageousness of will. How do you
Hi.
feel? Huh? Somebody saying something? No? We're okay?
I think
So,
it goes back to the first point of the leadership, meaning like if everybody's all together and one, as a nation or a group or whatever it is, and everyone's working with each other, that would never happen.
right, that would never happen. Good. Okay, good. Now let's move over to the side, one bar on this, and talk about what the Malbim writes on this issue. He says as follows, and let's take it back one step. There's a perspective in Judaism articulated heavily by Harambam, by Maimonides, that says the following. It says that there are the laws of nature based on which most people function in the world. So most people's lives are guided by the laws of nature, meaning if a person takes care of their body, they'll be healthy. If a person doesn't, God forbid it'll be the otherwise. If a person speeds on the highway, recklessly, that person will have an accident. So there's certain laws of nature. If a person jumps out of a building with 10 stories out of a building, that person will be hurt. That's a law of nature. So the world lives, generally speaking, within the laws of nature. Good. On the tip of the laws of nature, our rabbis say, there's an element of tohu vavohu, of chaos, that remained in the world. And our rabbis say that this tohu vavohu, this chaos, emerges from a point on the Temple Mount where the borders of Judah and Binyamin, the tribes of Judah and Binyamin met. So there's this thing called the laws of nature, which most of the world is governed by. Within the laws of nature, at its extreme, is this thing called tohu vavohu, or chaos, that remained in the system. Okay, so far?
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to add one more point and then give an example. So Harambam says as follows. Harambam says that the person who builds a close relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu will never be subject to the chaos, won't even be bounded by the laws of nature. That person will live in a platform of Kedusha, walking above, so to speak, the rest of the crowd. Hey, Erwin, walking above the rest of the crowd. Okay, so let's take it again. Most of the world is governed by what goes on in nature, and their actions will be responded to from nature as it was built to do. Good. Within that, there's an extreme tip called chaos, where from time to time, nature will lose its way and chaos will reign. What would that be? That would be a tsunami. That would be an earthquake. That would be, God forbid, a building collapsing. Maybe not. So there's the laws of nature and then there's chaos. most things on the planet are subject to those. The person that builds a close relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God, according to Harambam and others, pulls himself or herself out of that and creates a cocoon, a safety net around himself where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is blocking and tackling for him. Good? Now, the Malbim writes that when Bnei Israel moved away from God and gravitated towards the Goyim, and thereby didn't build these direct relationships to Borei Olam, to God, they were now subjected to the basic laws of nature, which are that tribes will go to war against each other, and the mightier ones will win. Well, one second. It never happened that way with Moshe or Yoshua. The Jews were always the weaker ones, and they just about always won. Well, that was because the God pulled them above the laws of nature and managed things for them. So, in the context of the book of Shoftim, the Malbim says that the Jews, because of their distance from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, were subjected to the rules of nature, which are that nations, that tribes, that city-states will wage war against each other, and they were simply subjected to that. Just that simple. What do you want? That's the way it works in the world. Whereas at these other times, these exceptionally good times, when they were closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they were thereby pulled above the laws of nature into a greater position of divine providence, where it didn't matter if they knew how to wage a war or not, they almost always won. How do we feel about that?
I like that.
Huh?
I like that.
Is that how a person should think though? Like, okay, if I get close to Hashem and I put that work in and do all that, is that how a person think? Oh, Hashem's gonna always protect me, or?
So it goes like this, Sonny. Great. I think on the one hand, the answer is yes. On the one hand, the answer is yes. That that person will not be subjected to chaos or even the laws of nature. That person will be in this little cocoon. At the same time, that person needs to maintain his membership or hers.
Right.
So when a person earns that, it means that person has acted exceptionally in building his relationship and has to keep raising the bar. Because when the person who's stepped up there then gets lazy, they'll slip back down. And when a person pushed himself or herself up, it means they made a much more valiant effort to get there. But the valiant effort doesn't guarantee it if you go stale at that point.
Right.
The what's being rewarded is the ongoing effort, the hunger to grow closer. That's what puts a person in a different place, with, God willing, a beautiful shell of light and around them. And you see it. By the way, you see it in people. Again, not that all good people have an easy life, absolutely not. But the person who's living that life and reflecting on the world around him or her can quantify in his or her mind that extra level of protection that he gets. And it's not because we live in this romantic, fantasy-like world with God. It's the exact opposite of that. So the point here is, A, to understand the structure of our world, Chukot HaTeva, laws of nature, and Tohu Vabohu, chaos. Then to see the platform above that, which is where we all want to be, and where HaKadosh Baruch Hu weighs in. Again, he weighs in completely. So the weighing in will be to block and tackle for the person. as long as the person is continuing to grow. You still like it, Rachel, or no?
I like it. I like it. I have a question. Is it only the block and tackle that you just said? Is that only like physical in the world, or could it be like mental also?
It's everything. It's everything.
So,
It's everything. I'll give you a couple of examples. Everybody, now, we all do things right and do other things. Nobody does things perfectly right. And sometimes you could look at your life and say, you know what? I really did these things not so well. And thank God, thank God there was a price to pay, but it was a very shallow price. It wasn't much of a price. Now, a typical thing, the classic thing is that, everybody needs a slap on the wrist from time to time. Everybody does. But the person who's closer, it just it's common sense, right? That really good student, that really good child, you're not gonna, when that child stumbles, you know who the child is, you know all they've done, you know what they deeply care about. So you're gonna do a little, smack on the wrists. But the child who really doesn't care, you don't really care that much either. And, you distance. I'm not using a child. Child's the wrong example. A student, a friend, a business associate who really doesn't care. So this is the collective system that Hamalbim describes for what happened at this time period in Jewish history. The Jewish people allowed themselves to drop down into commonplace living, subjected to the laws of nature, and therefore they were enslaved. They won and lost battles. They had all kinds of stuff like that, where they never knew of those things. They had one bad battle under Moshe, one half loss under Yoshua, but it was a romp every time they did it. This system is still very much alive and potent and in your face today. Yeah, Serene?
But would you say that the tohu vavohu is like what you were saying before about a chok? Like it's something you don't understand, but it still makes sense because Hashem is the one who's making that happen. The laws of nature are something that like a mishpat. We could understand it, but the chok is the tohu vavohu is really just like it's a chok. So it's like really basically what that those two type of things in that exist now in what happens in the world.
Right. So we just need to know that it's there. We need to know that this element of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and we're using terms that can't really work, right? But Hakadosh Baruch Hu saying, I'm taking a hands-off position on this, it's there. On the other hand, Hakadosh Baruch Hu saying, this is a really good guy. This is a person who's been trying very hard. And I'm going to make an extra effort to protect that person, to give that person greater reward than he or she deserves. To say that the system is not democratic and is not foolproof in the sense that there is a point where someone could go over the edge into this chaos position. But the very exciting point is that there is this beautiful cocoon position where, of course, things will not be perfect because God doesn't want someone to stop growing, but there's a huge blocking and tackling. And I'm sure that some of us can say that we've seen this, not because we're being childish about what happened or didn't happen in our lives, where when there was where there was one case or more where A plus B should have equaled C. It should have equaled C 100%. And C was yanked off the table and something altogether different happened. And that's what we're talking about here. So to the extent that in the context of Sefer Shoftim, the Jewish people jumped back on the page, they immediately re-engaged HaKadosh Baruch Hu because he never wants to be watching people subjecting themselves to the laws of nature, and certainly not to that extreme, no supervision kind of place. Okay, good. Now, let's just wrap up. Any thoughts at this point?
Yeah, okay.
Huh?
I have a thought, Rick.
Okay, hit it.
So I came in the ninth inning, but I wanted to still catch the end of the game. But so based on what you said, is there such a thing as, like you said, that Hakadosh Baruch Hu knows you're a good guy, so when you get off track, so is there such a thing as a drawdown on your credits? Say that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right.
But that's the beautiful point. It's a nice way to say it, because the drawdown on the credit is a slap on the wrist. It's a slap on the wrist.
Oh, okay, I got it.
That's the point. It's a slap on the wrist, because God knows, just like a parent would, who gives a child a minor slap on the wrist, God knows that because the person is in that higher zone, he or she is going to feel that slap on the wrist. Doesn't need any more than that.
Okay.
And he certainly doesn't need to be left to fend for himself. And this means a great level of personal responsibility. And it certainly means that. It's the opposite of kapara that we say now. It's the opposite of that. It's really the fabulous understanding that God is watching everything I'm doing, and to the extent that I work hard to put myself in a different place, I will get ongoing. I'll get the fumes of that positive way beyond what I worked hard to achieve. So, let's wrap up our introduction to Sefer Shoftim. It was this crazy seesaw, as Serene described when we first started. It was the same. It's the people of the same extraordinary children. We have to assume that it's because of their closeness to the non-Jews and the acculturation towards that. We have to assume maybe as well that it's because of the lack of proliferation of Torah learning. And maybe we assume as well that it was because of the lack of collective will. And that lack of collective will could have come from either of the first two, or it could simply have come from the lack of unity between the tribes. For us today, we're going to go through the rest of the book, primarily focused on the giant personalities whom we can learn from and own as part of our Torah knowledge. And also to just be sensitive to the underlying perspectives here. We live in a spectacular country. America is spectacular. But be sensitive to not internalizing too much of what's not ours. And I think we're overwhelmingly good with that, but maybe we have to be as aware as possible. The second thing is that, again, as I've said many times, everybody on this call is his own rabbi and teacher first, and that's the way it should be. And you should only go to ask somebody else if you can't open your own book and answer your own question. And that's who you should be to your children and your grandchildren. You should have your own book. You should be the person. And that's the method. And that's what seemed to be lacking at that time. And finally, the collective will to put myself in that exclusive place in this remarkable spectrum of physical and spiritual world, the physical and the metaphysical, to put myself above the physical, enjoying this platform. So ideally what we want an awareness to being Jewish so that we can enjoy some of the beautiful things that the non-Jews bring, but maintain fiercely, proudly who we are, which we overwhelmingly do, but maybe we catch ourselves from time to time. B, let our children picture us with a book in our hand. Do it. It ain't the end of the game. Every day is the new beginning day. And when Torah is in every household, directly from the leaders of the household, you'll never have this kind of situation where it's dependent on a rabbi giving a fabulous class, or a shofet, or a judge coming on the scene, or a king to save the day. It'll never be that. And finally, it's the collective will to work hard, to stay in a fabulous zone. Rambam describes it in the Moreh Nevuchim. He says that you want to be not only in the inner courtyard of God's palace, but you want to be in the inner sanctum. And that's achievable for everyone. And that's what we want. And that closeness is our protection and what enables us to live above the basic day-to-day and the laws of nature. Good. Questions, thoughts?
Could you please hold up that book of Shoftim?
Yeah.
Okay.
You got it? Great. Any other thoughts? We're good?
Love it. Thank you, Ricky.
Great. Thank you. Thank you,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good,
Thank
Chris.
you. Bye. Bye, Kara. Thank you.
Bye.